Okay, so
you're on.
what I'm going to head towards is making a leaf-shaped arrowhead. So we're typing from the Neolithic period, so we're looking at about 5,500 years ago. And the starting point, I've got a waste flake of flint from an axe head. And the first thing I need to do is take off some of these really thin, delicate edges. Because if I apply any pressure to those, they will just collapse. They're not strong enough to take a great deal of pressure.
Is there any reason why I want to ask this, the whiter stuff as opposed to the darker?
In terms of quality?
Yeah.
The black stuff tends to be harder, but this is actually a piece of Lincolnshire flint, and you can just see the banding running through this.
Yeah.
And that's how we know it's Lincolnshire flint. It's the only British flint really that we find that has that banding running through it. But it's still perfectly hard.
It's still the same sort of, like, it's still suitable to be used.
It flakes really nicely, excuse me, but it's still hard enough to do the job. It can withstand a lot of pressure. So, I'm just going to be using an antler tip for this, and I've got some pieces of leather to protect my hand, because I'm always pushing the flakes in the direction of my hand. Just placing the tip of the antler onto the edge, and then forcing off the flakes. Now this one's probably going to snap across the tip here, because you can see there's a fossil, what's left of the outline of a fossil just running around the edge there. So there's a good chance the tip will break off, but there's still plenty of meat left on this to make a nice arrowhead. So it's best that that breaks off at this point rather than waiting for the finishing touches. So I'm not really thinking about the final shape yet. All I'm doing is trying to get this as thin as possible. So obviously if it was going to be fitted into a nice thin arrow shaft, it couldn't be too thick, otherwise the two just won't go together. So they had to thin them down to a reasonable level. We do find some relatively chunky arrowheads, but they were always thin enough to go into a reasonable thickness arrow shaft. So you can see I've got
something gorgeous.
a fairly thick section here. That's what we call the bulb of percussion. It just means where it was hit, and the energy spreads out, produces a great big bulb, and then levels out. So what I've got to do is get rid of that really thick section. So all I'm really aiming for at the moment is a nice thin blank that I can then start to shape down. So what I'm doing is I'm placing the tip of the antler onto the edge of the flint, and then I'm applying my body weight, my upper body weight, my waif-like frame, onto the edge, and then forcing off flakes. And you can see it's now got a sharp edge running around the outside. I can now abrade that sharp edge to try and attack that bulb, to try and really start thinning it down. Needs a bit more abrasion, and I can really try and drive off some very big flakes. So you can see the bulbs already really starting to flatten down. So I need to abrade again in the same direction I did before, and then I can turn it over and use the tiny platform I've created by abrading to apply pressure again to try and get rid of the last part of that bump. There we go, so now you can see it's really flattened down. So I can start thinking about the final shape now. So I'm just crunching the edges away. Again, I'm trying to make some nice sharp edges. So I'm just crunching away at the edges, then I can re-abrade to make the edges nice and strong. Lots of people, when they start flint knapping, start to rush things and they forget to abrade the edges, but it's that abrasion that makes the edges strong enough to take either blows or pressure when pressure flaking. So I'm always trying to encourage people to just slow everything down, take their time, and make sure they're preparing the edges so they can take the pressure necessary to flake right the way across. So when you see those nicely made arrowheads, they've got that lovely rippled surface, and that's created by these removals shooting across the surface. So you can see now that the entire side or face of that piece of flint is now flaked right the way across. Because there's a slight concavity on this side, it hasn't flaked all the way across just yet, so I need to re-abrade and go back the other way. So while I'm abrading, I'm also shaping it. And you can see now it's starting to take on that slightly more leaf-shaped profile. You've always got to be very careful flaking into a concavity, because the flakes can go in as they shoot across the surface, but they can't go in and then resurface. So what happens is they run into a concavity and they just stop and leave a step. So you've got to be very careful that you don't take really big flakes just starting off to try and remove a concavity. You've got to take small ones, re-abrade, then go back again, and eventually you'll undermine it. See, this one's thinning down really nicely. And one of the trickiest things to do, especially with the arrowheads, is to really thin something down without just applying a little bit too much force and breaking the whole thing in two. So again, I'm crunching the edges off to make nice strong platforms. Starting to form a point, but I'm not going to start making a really thin, delicate point, because obviously I'm working in a concavity here, the palm of my hand, and if I make the tip too delicate, I'm holding this really tightly to keep it in place. There's always a chance that the tip will snap off, so the finishing touches are usually applied to the tip. Almost there. And just a little bit more grinding. And then I can apply the finishing flakes that will also add a little bit of serration to the edge. Now they didn't seem too concerned about serrations on the Arrowhead, but we do find examples that are quite nicely serrated, and there's always a possibility that that was a benefit to penetration depth, because if you've got a nice serrated edge, there's no better edge for cutting through meat. Almost there. Famous last words. I was saying to somebody earlier that they do tend to break, and it's usually as you're adding the finishing touches. And there I think we see the origins of foul language. So a few flakes off this side, then the other side, along the same edge, and we're done.
You didn't say 9 inches? 9 inches, £11 in gold. Yeah. Like with 22 9 inches.
Just bringing it up towards the tip now. Just play with the symmetry a little bit. So this would be pretty much an average sized arrowhead. We do find much larger versions, but we also find really tiny arrowheads. And it's always assumed, if we're looking at really tiny arrowheads, that they were used for deer or really small game. But we see cultures around the world hunting fairly large species of deer with very small arrowheads, and that's because they're using plant poisons on the tips as well to slow the animals down. So this particular type of arrowhead didn't need to make a really horrendous wound like the barbed and tanged arrowheads if they were using plant poisons as well. So I'm just going to work on the point now, sharpen it up to a nice tip. And that's really just done with using the tip of the antler to abrade it to a nice sharp point, because if I try flaking it at this stage, it's going to make a very, very thin, delicate point that's going to break more than likely in the quiver. So it just needs to have a little bit of thickness to it, so it can take that kind of abuse and it'll hold up on impact as well. So there we go, it's a Neolithic leaf-shaped arrowhead.
Towards the camera.
Yep.
Yeah, I'm going to have 18 inches. My old cauldron.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you for that.
What have you done with the debris?